Warning: the following story contains themes of emotional distress and self-deletion. Viewer discretion is advised. To think, I built my entire life based on my faith and service to the Lord, only to have it shot down when I least expected it. I thought I did the right thing, but I was tricked. And now the church thinks of me as a traitor, a defiler. I guess this is the price I pay for my ignorance. Perhaps one day I'll be able to atone for the sin I had committed. Today, sadly, is not that day. Or is it? I woke up in my usual place, my home, just a little ways away from the church I had gone to. I guess I'm still holding on to some false hope, as I still attend the services of the church. Of course, they still allow me to show up there, but I'm treated as an exile, almost as if I didn't exist. The only person who even remotely mentions or acknowledges me is the Reverend, the preacher. His comments about my presence are always vague, and he said one of the same phrases he repeats most of the time today. The sheep who has lost the shepherd is with us today. Indeed, it is a little unflattering that he has to call me out every time I'm here. But that seems to be a small price to pay right now. Compared to almost total exclusion from the church, slight embarrassment is a joke. The service went on as usual, although the Reverend seemed a bit more irate with my presence as always. It seems as if he has run out of things to talk about, so he just repeats the same things every week. Disappointing if you ask me. It's always more to learn from the Lord. Soon enough, he had stopped speaking, and everyone had started to leave to continue on with their days. None had stopped to speak with me, as always. I used to be one of the most well-known people here. Everyone wanted to hear my stories. I guess I should already understand that time had come and gone. This is where I would usually make my way out as well. This time, however, something told me to try and speak with the Reverend. What had been guiding me to this conclusion was unknown to me, perhaps the Holy Spirit guiding me. So instead, I stood up and made my way to the altar that stood near the back of the church, where the Reverend had been standing, and he still was. As I approached, I saw him turn his back, as if he was trying to ignore me. As soon as I got in speaking distance, the Reverend spoke up. Still clinging to what you once were, lost one? I tried to respond to his words, but no words of my own came from me. It was a strange feeling that was almost overwhelming. I simply stood there until he had continued to speak to me, his tone changing from his aggressive, brash tone to a more somber one. Perhaps I had been too harsh on you. Perhaps our Lord still has a place for you up above. A test of faith may bring you back into his grace. Again, I had tried to respond, but I simply could not speak back. No questions of mine could be answered because I could not ask them. No concerns of mine could be eased because I could not confess them. I stood there blankly while the Reverend, even though he faced away from me, I could tell he saw right through me. He spoke up one last time. Go on. Find your redemption. I can guide you no further. I was then compelled to leave the church. My legs began to move of their own accord, forcing me to walk to the exit. Eventually, I had made it out the front doors, and my legs came back under my control. I tried to walk back into the church to see if I could ask my question now, but I was unable to enter, as if a barrier was cast between me and the place. Walking back to my home was always a pretty nice experience, as I had to cut through a small forest path that had been cultivated by the people who planted many beautiful flowers along the path. Now it just reminded me too much of the past, what I had lost. Eventually, I made it back home. For some reason, my emotions started to get to me slightly, and I almost stumbled in through the door. A sudden sense of vertigo struck me, and I quickly stumbled over to a chair I had in my living room. When the dizziness subsided, I felt a single tear run down my face. I stood back up and walked over to my bathroom to clean myself up. I entered the bathroom and stood in front of the sink, staring into the mirror that hung above it. Strangely enough, I could barely see myself in the reflection. All I saw was my figure, and my face blurred out. I shook it off, turned on the sink and splashed some water on my face, turned off the sink, then made my way over to my study. As I entered the room, a sense of nostalgia overcame me. I had not been in this room for quite some time, as I had been avoiding it until now. As to why I did this, I'm unsure, but now I knew I had to be here. Just as the Reverend said, I had to find some way to find redemption, and something told me this would be the place to find it. I started sifting through some of the papers I had on my desk, searching for something that I might be able to do in order to redeem myself in the eyes of the Lord. I was growing tired of the fate I had been suffering. I wanted to finally be free from this cycle. I found a particular paper about a haunting I was following back before all of this. People claimed that they were being disturbed by some sort of demonic force. They said that it killed their infant. The police had not bought their story, and the two parents were booked for murdering the child, while their other kid, a 10-year-old boy, was taken to an orphanage. A pretty disturbing story, but perhaps I could resolve this demonic force. Perhaps that would align me back in good faith. This revelation struck me like a lightning bolt. I suddenly realized I did have some way to escape this sort of hell I was stuck in. I quickly gathered all my items, things to help cleanse the place, and a few useful tools, such as a flashlight and knife. I threw on a brown fedora and a heavy overcoat over what I had been wearing that day, then made my way back to my front door. I hesitated for a moment, considering if this truly was the right decision. After a quick second, I swiftly understood this was my only chance, and that I had to take it. Luckily, the house where this said demonic possession took place wasn't too far from my own house. A relatively lengthy walk later, and I had arrived at the house, the sun setting behind it. Looking around, it seemed as if the house had been abandoned now, most likely due to the story that had followed it. Rust had built up on the metal bits that had covered the structure. The windows were boarded up with planks of wood. Moss had started to grow and cover the entire left side of the house. I'm not here to critique the condition of the house, however. My job is to cleanse this house of the demon that may or may not be residing here. I went to the front door, locked. I went around the house, hopping the fence into the backyard, and I tried the back door, locked. After a bit of thinking, I went back to the front door and saw there was a floor mat sitting right in front of the front door. I checked under it, and there it was, a dull brass key right under the mat. I grabbed the key and stuck it in the front door. A loud click echoed from the door, and it slowly swung open as I turned the knob. Stepping inside, the interior of the living room was pretty typical for an abandoned house. Random furniture laid about, covered in dust and grime. I stepped into the kitchen, seeing the destroyed appliances and cabinets. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, so I continued to move deeper into the house, a sense of dread filling me as I made my way deeper into the place, as if some force had been watching me. This sense convinced me that something had to be residing here. I made my way upstairs, still not encountering anything suspicious or supernatural. The anticipation at this point was killing me, as the sense of being watched only strengthened as I explored more of the house. I checked all the bedrooms and bathrooms on the second floor, encountering the usual accommodations of the abandonment as before. Now, there was only one more place I've yet to check. The basement. I headed back downstairs and approached a mysterious door that had sat in between the living room and kitchen. The door was moldy and rotten, but still standing, and provided a thick barrier between me and whatever was down in the basement. I placed my hand on the knob the door had, and it refused to turn, as if it were stuck in place. After fiddling with the doorknob for a minute or two, I started ramming into the door with my shoulder. After the third hit, the door suddenly broke open. I went tumbling down the old splintered wooden stairs that led downward. As I was falling and falling, I felt more and more pain surrounding my body, a dizzy feeling starting to set in. Eventually, after a thud louder than all the rest, my violent descent came to a halt when I finally came to the bottom of the stairs. I laid there on the ground for a second, regaining my composure, trying to recover from the physical trauma I had just endured. Sitting up, I got a decent view of the entire basement, though a bit dark. Again, the basement looked pretty typical, nothing too crazy to see. There was a washer and dryer sitting in one corner, and a bunch of boxes scattered about. I pulled my flashlight from my pocket, turned it on, and started to scan the area around me. I looked around, and to my confusion, there was another door, sitting in another corner of the room. I rationalized this as a door that simply connected to another house's basement, but at the time, it just seemed really odd to me. I stood up, pain still surging through my entire body, and limped over to the unknown door. Once I got over to the door, I tried to turn the knob it had. This time, the doorknob simply turned, and I pushed the door open. Yet another set of stairs was presented to me. At first, I was contemplating whether or not I should actually continue, when I heard a faint whisper echo out from below. "Accept your fate." The voice, it almost sounded familiar. It beckoned me. I couldn't ignore it. I couldn't convince myself I was just hearing things. I know I just heard that. That voice, it had an evil ring to it. It must have been the demon that was here. Now I knew I had to go down there, because down there is where my redemption lied. Fighting through the excruciating pain, I started to slowly step down the stairs. A loud creak echoed out on every step, blocking out any other noise that may be present. After what felt like forever walking down the stairs, I eventually made it to the bottom, to another barren room. Although, there was one interesting thing that laid in the middle of the room. A relatively small tree, though the branches looked sturdy enough to hold a person. A single solemn noose hung from its thickest branch on it. This tree, it looked familiar. The tree almost seemed transparent, like it wasn't even there. It was more like a projection, rather than a physical object. A figure then appeared out of nowhere, walking towards the tree. This thing that appeared to be a person frightened me at first, but it simply walked past me, its gaze locked on the tree. It had short blonde hair, and seemed relatively lanky, wearing a similar outfit to the one I had been wearing right now, with a face resembling a man in his late 20s. From what I could tell, it looked exactly like me. The revelation caught me off guard, and it freaked me out. I started praying out loud as the figure arrived at the base of the tree, right below the noose. I hadn't noticed it at first, but the figure was carrying a small step stool. I started to back away from the tree as the figure began to move its lips. It didn't sound directed at me, but to the Lord himself. The figure stared at the sky, a tear rolling down its face as it began to speak. "Lord, I hope this is what you want. I have nothing left. Pray mercy on my soul, for this life had none." The figure placed the stool on the ground and stood on it. It grabbed the noose and put its head through the loop. After a second or two, a look of fear came in the figure's eyes. It then kicked the stool out from under its feet. The noose kept the figure's feet from meeting the ground, as the figure began to struggle, trying to pull itself back up from its self-imposed hanging. Eventually the figure, now a body, went limp, and stopped fighting the fate it had put on itself. I stood there for a moment, shocked as to what I had just witnessed. I wasn't exactly surprised. I knew exactly what had happened, and I was no stranger to this event. But to see it for myself, it was scarring. The image of this figure hung was now burned into my mind, appearing in every direction I looked. After a second, the tree and the body faded away, causing the room to suddenly go pitch black. I stood there motionless in the darkness as I started to hear voices just a few feet away from me, taunting me. You did this to yourself, sinner. You are to blame. Started looking around wildly, hearing the same voices in every direction. Eventually, the room brightened up slightly, enough for me to make out another figure in the darkness. I was suddenly guided to the ornate cross attached to my jacket. I pulled it out of my jacket and pointed it towards the figure. Words started to pour from my mouth, not forcefully, but more instinctually. In the name of the Lord, you, bastard son of the forsaken angel, you are compelled to return to your home in the fiery pits of hell, for this is not your land to be taking. The figure recoiled, clearly affected by the power I had compelled against it. The verse I had spoken, which I didn't recognize coming anywhere from the Bible, spilled forth from my mouth again, this time a little louder. In the name of the Lord, you, a bastard son of the forsaken angel, you are compelled to return to your home in the fiery pits of hell, for this is not your land to be taking. The figure took a few steps back, raising its arms and wailing in anguish. I continued to speak, taking a few steps forward with the cross in hand. This time the verse was louder than all the rest, to the point where I thought I was yelling. In the name of the Lord, you, a bastard son of the forsaken angel, you are compelled to return to your home in the fiery pits of hell, for this is not your land to be taking. The wails the figure was emanating grew louder and louder, and I saw as it slowly crumbled onto the ground in front of me. The world felt as if it were violently shaking, loud quaking noises now consuming my hearing. Then, a faint ringing was all I was able to hear. My vision began to white out. I panicked for a second, confused as to what was happening. I then looked up, seeing a golden light coming from up above. Everything then turned white. I felt myself awaken, so I shot up to a sitting position in the bed I was lying in. I looked around for a second. It was my house. Everything in the same place as before, though everything felt a little different than before. I got up, still wearing what I had been wearing when I went to that house. At first, I could barely remember the event, but as time passed, the details came back to me. Did I do it? I spoke out loud, confused as to why I was back at my home. I made my way out of my house, a calming feeling filling me. I started to make my typical walk down the forest path, except this time, there was someone walking in the opposite direction. Around the middle of the path, I saw a person walking in the opposite direction that I was. As we got closer and closer to each other, I saw it was a woman, probably about the same age as me. We locked eye contact and she smiled, nodded, and waved at me. We then passed each other, walking our separate ways. This might have seemed like an insignificant event, but to me, this was the one thing I could have hoped for. It was the first time someone other than the Reverend acknowledged me. As I was walking, I almost broke down to tears as I finally knew I had returned to a good alignment with the Lord. I was finally back to the man I was before. I sped up, starting to run through the forest path to make my way to the church as fast as possible. After a short time of sprinting, I made it to the front doors of the church. I quickly opened the doors and started walking through the main aisle between the seats to make my way to the altar, when the Reverend had been standing. I saw him in his usual spot, facing away and standing stiffly. I walked up to the altar and started to speak with him, words finally emanating from my mouth. Reverend? Did I do it? Has the Lord finally let me back into the light? He was silent for a moment, standing there as if he didn't notice me. Eventually he did speak up, a simple question coming from his lips. Did you? I was stunned for a moment. I know that voice. No. No. The Reverend turned to me, revealing his face to have a sinister grin upon it. His eyes turned a bright, bloody red. A dark aura emanated from his entire body, his voice now much deeper and demonic than before. He began to speak up to me, to my soul even. It was a thunderous, commanding voice that now filled the chapel. Oh, there's no coming back for you. I tried to turn and run, but my legs would not obey me. I was forced to stay right in place, to witness as the Reverend floated up above the ground, emitting a joyous and terrifying cackle. As he got higher and higher, the chapel began to darken and darken. Eventually, the building was pitch black, but his laughter still echoed out like a witch in the night. After a few seconds of this horrifying situation I was put in, the laughter abruptly stopped. A few more seconds passed, and I started to feel the ground beneath me crumbling. Holes appeared around me, revealing a hideous reddish-orange light peeking out from under. I tried to avoid the holes at first, but soon enough, more and more of them appeared, and eventually I was caught by one, and I started to fall. I kept falling, further and further down, a red glow consuming my vision. The air around me kept getting hotter and hotter the further I went down. I screamed out for someone to help me, someone to save me. The agony I was experiencing was already unbearable, and there were surely more to come. I was terrified of what I was about to experience, because I knew exactly where I was falling to. I was heading to the one place I had been trying to avoid my whole life.